Welcome back to another episode of Taking Down Trump. I'm your host, Tristan Snell. We have another amazing show, an amazing guest for you this week. Andrea Chalupa of the Gaslit Nation podcast is going to be joining us for a really awesome conversation. But first, as always, we're going to get into the craziest stories from law and politics this week. Our crazy story, the craziest, I'm just going to lead off with it, is at this point, as I'm taping this, it is breaking news right now because we have another Bob Woodward book. As most of you know, but I'll make sure to unpack for everybody, Bob Woodward of Woodward and Bernstein fame, they were the two reporters who broke the story on Watergate back in the 70s. Bob Woodward has continued to do investigative reporting as an author. He was at the Washington Post for many, many years. He's now sort of a reporter and editor emeritus there, and then continues to do these books that, as political junkies know, are always must-reads. He manages to get information out of people that nobody else can get. People seem to let him hang around even when they're doing things that are unsavory and or maybe illegal. And Donald Trump has continued to be one of these people. I think there's this, it's somehow one of the last journalistic institutions left is the idea that if Bob Woodward comes and wants to be a fly on the wall in your White House, you're supposed to let him. Even if the stuff you're doing, or in your post-White House, fake White House crap, in the case of Donald Trump, you're supposed to just let him. Because I think the thought is that if you don't, it'll look bad, or that he'll say, well, they wouldn't let me in, and that means they had something to hide. Anyhow, the point is we've got a Bob Woodward book, and that means that we've got lots of new revelations about Donald Trump, including that he has been extra cozy, even cozier than we thought he was, with one Vladimir Putin. He made, to the count that we've got here, at least 7 one-on-one phone calls with Vladimir Putin since leaving the presidency. He leaves the presidency in January 2021, and he's had at least 7 one-on-one phone calls with Vladimir Putin since then. Donald Trump is not a head of state. Donald Trump does not have a foundation. He's not been going on a speaking tour. He didn't write a memoir. He doesn't have a presidential library. He didn't do any of the normal things. He's not a goodwill ambassador. He's not going to the Olympics. He's not doing any of the things that ex-presidents normally do that might have created a legitimate reason for him to talk to a current sitting head of state with whom he had intercourse, shall we say, back during the 2017 to 2021 timeframe. Donald Trump has already noted that he talked to Vladimir Putin right before Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. This raises serious, huge questions about the legalities of this with, again, the Logan Act. There's a federal law that dates back to 1799 to the presidency of John Adams. That's how far back we had a problem with this that the Congress and the president felt needed to be addressed, and was enshrined in federal law that a private citizen of the United States cannot go engaging in foreign policy that undercuts the interest of the United States of America. This law is on the books, and it looks for all the world, again, like Donald Trump has been violating it left, right, and center. That he potentially violated it with regard to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, according to PBS reporting, saying that Trump and Netanyahu have struck a secret deal whereby Netanyahu is deliberately not engaging in ceasefire talks until after the U.S. election to try to help Donald Trump. And now 7 or more phone calls between Trump and Putin. What is being said on those phone calls? Did Donald Trump record them? Because he might have. Were there witnesses to the calls? Because they should be questioned. What exactly is going on here? I'm not saying that we're necessarily going to be able to get to the bottom of it. If they had a phone call and nobody else was around and it wasn't recorded, how are we going to find out what was said? But the fact of the matter stands, the FBI and DOJ need to be fully investigating this. This is a serious federal crime, potentially. It must be investigated. Just the fact that these calls took place is enough to merit an investigation if you then add in the PBS report. Right? The idea that Donald Trump is engaging in foreign policy, cutting deals with foreign leaders to help himself and undercutting the stated foreign policy of the United States, that is a crime. It must be investigated. And to top it all off is just a little dirty cherry on the top of this. Remember when you couldn't get COVID tests back in 2020 for yourself, for your loved ones? Well, it turns out Donald Trump was giving them away to Vladimir Putin during that time period when we had shortages. Yes, I'll say that again. Donald Trump was giving our COVID tests to Vladimir Putin during the pandemic. So that's just other little fun facts that we're learning from this latest Bob Woodward book. Next, a story that is going to be dominating the headlines, already is in a lot of ways, and it's going to get, sadly, a whole lot worse. We have a new, even stronger, even more devastating hurricane brewing in the Gulf of Mexico. Hurricane Milton is due to make landfall on the Gulf Coast of Florida within the next 72 hours or less. It is up to a Category 5 and is in the process of creating horrible damage on the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. It is headed, often hurricanes go from east to west. This one's actually going to be going from west to east and then slamming into the Gulf Coast of Florida. It could be far more devastating than Hurricane Helene, and that's hard to fathom. This is already now this is the fourth worst hurricane ever on record in terms of strength of the hurricane. Fourth worst ever. And we've been keeping these records going back to about the 1870s or so. That's how bad this is. We're talking about one of the worst storms in history, and it's headed for Florida. And what could happen here is going to be terrible, but I have to say it would be so much worse if Donald Trump's Project 2025 comes to fruition, because he wants to get rid of the National Weather Service and NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration that the NWS is part of. So how would we be able to track these storms? 80% of meteorology that you consume is data that's actually coming from the federal government, over 80%. If you get rid of that and you just have private meteorology in there, we're going to lose a wealth of data that saves lives, because we can track these storms with some accuracy now. We know where they're going to hit. We can give evacuation orders. We can enforce those evacuation orders, and those evacuations save lives. Because if we don't have as many people in the storm's path, then fewer people die, fewer people get injured, fewer people are stuck there without food and water and have to be evacuated after the storm comes through via a helicopter because they didn't get out in their car before the storm. Okay. Then they also want to cut and gut FEMA, which provides a lot of the rescue and recovery efforts after a storm. And also they want to cut the block grant funding that the federal government provides to a state like Florida or North Carolina or Georgia after a state of emergency has been declared. That federal funding, which is a lifeline for these counties and cities and states that otherwise would not be able to handle it, Donald Trump and Project 2025, they want to get rid of that. So if you live in Florida, if you live in Georgia, if you live in North Carolina, Donald Trump is going to leave you out. He is going to I would say he'd leave you high and dry, except that it's going to be the exact opposite. You're going to be stuck with that flooding. Oh, they want to get rid of federally backed flood insurance too. So you're going to be stuck with that flooding. You're not going to know the storm's coming. And then they're not going to help you after the storm comes. If they do what they say in Project 2025, it would be the most devastating presidency to the southeastern states ever. It would just be an absolute death sentence for thousands and thousands of people in the Southeast who suffer from these huge storms. And the federal government would basically be like, sorry, you're on your own. That's what Donald Trump wanted. One more big story that is just breaking now. We're getting a report from the office of Democratic Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, who was a guest on the show a few months ago, where they have been digging into exactly what happened during the confirmation hearings of Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. And it is as bad as we thought. The Trump White House completely sat on over 4,500 tips that were made to the FBI. That's a seriously high number of tips where there was a tip line open, that people had information, especially pertaining to the allegations of sexual misconduct by Kavanaugh. People then submitted these tips by the thousands. and they were forwarded on orders. They were forwarded to the Trump White House that did nothing with them. So it came through the FBI tip line, and then they were just put in a box. Nothing happened. They were only allowed to interview 10 witnesses. They were not allowed to engage in a more fulsome investigation, which was 100% merited given the credible accusations of sexual misconduct against Kavanaugh by multiple different women, especially Christine Blasey Ford. And we'll never know what exactly would have been brought to light during that time that could have swayed it. Ultimately, the Senate voted to confirm Kavanaugh by a vote of 51-49. And if we had actually had a real investigation, if those tips had been followed up on, if more witnesses could have been interviewed, we might have found out more. We might have found out that maybe there wasn't anything to the allegations and there wasn't enough corroboration and that Kavanaugh's name should be cleared. But the point is, we'll never know. And the fact that the Trump people sat on it shows guilt in my mind. It shows that they knew damn well that there was going to be damning stuff in those tips and in other interviews that they could conduct, and they sat on it. They made sure that the FBI basically had its you-know-what's cut off and wasn't allowed to actually do their job. It's called the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and they weren't allowed to investigate someone who was about to become one of the highest officials in the land with a lifetime tenure, total unaccountability, basically untouchable as a human being, as one of the 9 most powerful people on the planet, and he wasn't allowed to be investigated. One of our other biggest stories of the week we're going to get into next, and that is the huge DOJ brief that was unsealed in the DC January 6th case, and some unsolved mysteries about January 6th and what the heck is going on with that investigation overall. We'll come back to that in a minute. Welcome back, and let's talk about the DC January 6th case, where Judge Tanya Chutkan, she is the judge presiding over this case at the district court level in Washington, D.C., now that the case has come back there after the immunity decision from the Supreme Court back in the summer. Judge Chutkan unsealed a 165-page brief from DOJ, from Special Counsel Jack Smith and his team, regarding the immunity question and exactly what evidence the government plans to introduce at trial, and arguing that those pieces of evidence, those crimes that they are going to cover, that they want to go to trial on, are not official acts of the presidency such that Donald Trump could be immune from them per the Supreme Court's opinion back in the summer. Let's unpack this because there's a lot here. What happened here is, let's go back to the immunity decision. The line that the Supreme Court tried to draw was between official acts and unofficial acts. Official acts are things like, oh, you're in the Situation Room and you're doing X, Y, and Z. I'm just giving an example here. They didn't say this. I'm just coming up with one, okay? Signing a bill. What are the things that the president does? One of them is to appoint other high officials. There are certain things that are constitutional tasks or other required duties of the office, actions of the office. And the Supreme Court says that if you're engaging in one of those, then that president is immune from any criminal prosecution for engaging in that act. As wrong-headed as that is, because it opens up the possibility of, okay, well, the president is commander in chief. If the president then directs the military to unconstitutionally, illegally murder American citizens just because they're political opponents or otherwise in the way, is that somehow now an official act because the president was exercising his powers as commander-in-chief? That is insanely something that we don't know, because the Supreme Court came up with this crazy rule and didn't actually consider the ramifications of it fully. But we don't actually need to talk about that here, because here we have a set of clearly unofficial acts. And this is what DOJ argues, and I agree with them, that the acts that Donald Trump undertook in the run up to January 6th were the acts of a candidate for president. They were the acts of an office seeker, not an office holder, in the words of the DC Circuit opinion on this topic. And thereby, pretty much the entirety of DOJ's original case should go to trial. DOJ has withdrawn the part of, well, they had to, because the Supreme Court basically said the part of DOJ's case regarding the weaponization of the Department of Justice was, I believe wrongfully, now excluded. It's gone. We're not going to get to have that because that's considered to be an official act of the president. I don't believe that it's an official act of the president to sit down with members of the Department of Justice, one of whom is now a co-conspirator with you, and then saying, yeah, we're going to then issue a Department of Justice report falsely stating that there was voter fraud when there wasn't, so that it lends legitimacy to this big lie of voter fraud that supposedly stole the election from Donald Trump when it did not. That is not an official act. Very much not. Managing to rope in somebody else in the government to do your dirty work with you is not an official act just because it's someone that you appointed or you could appoint because he was thinking during that same time period of taking the official in question, Jeffrey Clark. Yeah, Trump was thinking of taking Clark and making him the acting attorney general. So because that was going to be part potentially of the quid pro quo, hey, you falsely issue a report about election fraud and I'll make you the acting AG, because there was an appointment power issue in there that suddenly makes it an official, like, let's just put that aside for now. That just reeked to high heaven, but let's just move on. The rest of the case deals with the fake elector scheme, issues of when Trump knew that the voter fraud wasn't real and when did he know it, all of that. The inciting of sending the mob to the Capitol on January 6th to obstruct the official proceeding, the certification of the Electoral College vote, his attempt to pressure Mike Pence into participating in that conspiracy. All of those things are, I think DOJ makes a very good argument here. The presidency does not have any official role in the counting of votes or the determination of who won the election. There's no role for the presidency in that at all. None. It's not in the Constitution. It's not in any federal laws. It's not in any regs. There's nothing. It's not by tradition. There's nothing. Nothing. Elections are generally handled by the states and local governments, right? The state then comes up with its official tally, figures out who's going to win that state's electoral votes, and then that goes to the Electoral College. And the Electoral College, there's no rule. We can draw, I should go Katie Porter style here. We can draw on a whiteboard the fact that, like, look, you can draw where the White House is and then go right past it, because the Electoral College folks, they report to Congress. They send the count to Congress. There is no role for the presidency here. So there is no point at which a president, any president, would be exercising any of his or her official powers in having anything to do with the counting of the election, of the Electoral College count, any of it. None of it. None of it has anything to do with the presidency. The presidency is the object of that effort, not the subject of that effort, so to speak, right? The actors in that process are voters, state officials, the Electoral College, and Congress. That's the chain of custody for figuring out the math and who won and then who gets to be president. So none of this counts as official acts. And then they go through all of this in exquisite detail regarding all of their evidence. And this gets back to a point that I made back in the summer when a lot of us were worried about this immunity decision. And it turned out to be as bad as we were fearing. And what I tried to tell everybody back then that I think is kind of turning out to be true, I wish it had been even more true than it was, is that now we've had this revelation of all of these facts out in the open during October, right in the run up to the election. So that was not great for Donald Trump, although sadly the news cycle has already seemed to move on. I don't know how much we're really going to be talking about Trump and his conspiracy and his coup attempt, because that's what it was. I think the people who know and believe that it was a coup and a conspiracy are already planning to vote against him. People who think that it was all legitimate are planning on voting for him. And I don't know, out of all of the people that are still trying to figure out what they're going to do with their ballot, maybe it moved some people. I'm still kind of hoping that it was, especially given that people are already voting, right? Like, you probably have already voted. There's a good chance you have, or you're about to vote. You're about to vote by mail. You're about to vote early at a polling place in some jurisdictions, right? The presidential election is no longer something that happens all on one day, right? It happens on a rolling basis over the course of weeks, months, and it's happening right now. The election is already very much under swing. We have no idea how it's going, except that we do know about the number of mail-in ballots that have been received. We know how much early voting is happening, and we can surmise from that that there is probably even stronger Democratic turnout than there was in 2020. That's a kind of a side note, but since that early vote has swung very heavily Democratic in these recent elections, and that early vote has been very, very high, that is probably a good sign for the friends and allies of democracy. But let's get back to this opinion again real quick. Again, Donald Trump won that immunity case, but it definitely does not mean that he is out of the woods. This case is continuing now. I am still wondering whether or not we might actually get any other revelations regarding any of this horrible misconduct and criminal activity that DOJ has buckets of evidence regarding. Clearly, they've got text messages, they've got email, they've got people who have flipped and are going to testify, and they haven't even produced everything that they have to produce because they don't have to. They just produced what they needed to produce to win this issue. Now, what's going to happen with the rest of this case? I think Judge Chutkan is going to say the indictment, as it's currently been redrawn in a superseding indictment, is good to go. You're going to trial. Trump will appeal. It'll go to the D.C. Circuit. The D.C. Circuit is going to agree with Judge Chutkan. I hope that they don't take too long in doing so, but they might issue another really long opinion that then takes time for them to do. Fine. Then it's probably going back to SCOTUS. I imagine that we're going to see a second Trump case on immunity go back to SCOTUS next year if a Trump presidency hasn't mooted the whole thing because he fires Jack Smith and nobody does anything about it, which is exactly what could happen. But if I'm still cautiously optimistic that that isn't going to happen, because I'm cautiously optimistic that Trump's going to lose this election, in which case these prosecutions that are ongoing are going to steadily march forward. They're going too slowly. I wish that we didn't have all these delays. I've written about this a bunch on my Substack. I'm going to talk about it more here too. But these cases are marching on. Even when they've hit setbacks, they continue to march on. So I do believe that we're going to learn more about all of this. And I do believe eventually Trump's going to stand trial. I really do. Although I do think there is a possibility here that the Supreme Court could turn around and just squash all of this and say, nope, it was actually all official acts. Everything that he did in that was an official act. But if we read through the tea leaves of that immunity decision back from the summer, it would appear that Amy Coney Barrett is definitely on board with deeming a lot of the indictment to be unofficial acts of a candidate, not of the president. And Roberts, it's a little bit more unclear. That's going to be the real key to that entire process. When we have this case go back to SCOTUS next year, what will John Roberts do? He is clearly the swing vote. His voice will carry the day. He will probably write the opinion. He's going to have to call balls and strikes as to whether or not these things were official versus unofficial acts, as horrifying as that sounds. But let's just talk about other things that I really wish could have happened with regard to this January 6th investigation that I was actually thinking would happen, but they have not happened. To me, the entire premise of just going after Trump, they only indicted Trump, DOJ. They didn't indict his co-conspirators, as happened down in Georgia. I thought that it was because they were going for speed. If they only went after Trump, it was going to be streamlined. It was only a handful of counts. It was only one defendant. They were gunning to get a trial done. I had thought and hoped that it could happen in the spring and summer of this year. Obviously, it did not. But now I'm scratching my head at this because they had a chance to do a superseding indictment. They did it. They didn't name anybody else. They maneuvered the indictment to get around that immunity opinion, and I think they've done a good job of that. But in my view, where the hell are all of the other co-conspirators in this indictment, in the federal DC case? Where are they? Because now I don't understand why you're not actually charging the rest of the people that are obviously criminal co-conspirators in this. You know all of the same material that the Atlanta people, you seem to know more of it, right? You know about people like John Eastman and Rudy Giuliani, right? You know what roles they played in this whole conspiracy. You name them and then redact them, but it's clear who they are in this unsealed opinion. Now you obviously know all about this. It's plain as day. You know what all of these other people did to break the law, and you're not charging any of them. I think there's a deeper question here about what happened with allied members in the House. What did they know? How were they read in? And things we still don't know that are mysteries about January 6th itself, about the pipe bomber, about the fact that the mob seemed to know exactly where the unreinforced windows in the Capitol were and went right to them. Somebody tipped them off. Who? It was clearly partly an inside job. There's no doubt about it. Who had done these tours beforehand? Who knew about them? Clearly, some elements of that violent mob knew where to go in the facility. They knew the Capitol is a sprawling place. Okay, it has all these other tunnels that go to the other office buildings where the members of Congress have their offices. It's a massive, massive, massive place if you haven't been there, the Capitol. Okay, it's not just that one big building. It's actually 7 buildings. It's the main Capitol and then 6 other federal office buildings. And then it probably connects to others that I'm not even aware of, but that's just the 6 that I can think of. Okay, that whole complex is very difficult to navigate if you don't know about it. And clearly some people in the mob did know where to go. They knew how to find people's different offices. There were also other issues where Mike Pence's key card had been disabled. How did that happen? We still don't know. We still don't know how certain members of Congress had their panic buttons disabled. If you work in a federal office for a high-profile official, this is true for judges too, which is why I know this, you've got to, even if it's not just the judge, even if you're one of the judge's clerks, you've got a panic button under your desk that is there. I had it when I clerked for a federal judge because we dealt with cases with hardened criminals, with terrorism implications, all sorts of things that came through our chambers, and the whole building needed to be very secure. This is in Brooklyn. It's the Eastern District of New York. They have prosecuted some of the biggest criminals of the past 50 years, like John Gotti and El Chapo. When you have cases like that, you have a security concern and you have a panic button. The panic buttons for some members of Congress had been cut off. By whom? We still don't know. So there are a lot of other things that I believe either should be investigated or they have been investigated and they should be brought as additional indictments, additional defendants to this indictment that we still don't have. And why not? The whole reason to just charge Trump and keep it lean is gone. You're not going to be able to get a quick trial, a quick conviction. That's not happening. This case is going to take years and years to resolve. The DC case, any of these cases, we still have years to go. And we're not even thinking about appeals yet, right? There's all of these different things that are going to have to happen for these cases to go forward. Why not just go and try more of these people or set up a second indictment where you indict some of these other people and you go after some of the other things that happened connected to January 6th? Why haven't we seen that? That is a question that all of us need to be asking right now, but also as we go forward into what will hopefully be a first term for President Kamala Harris, knock on wood. Hopefully that happens, but we need to see some more action out of DOJ or some sense of why we aren't seeing that action. Because I think a lot of us have been getting deeply frustrated. We're only going to get the justice that we demand, that we ask for, that we push for. And we need to keep up that fight to make sure that every single perpetrator related to January 6th has their day in court and sees justice. And maybe they're going to be exonerated, and probably they won't if they actually really stand trial. But they have to stand trial. You can't just say they don't get to because DOJ didn't charge them or because the Supreme Court says they're immune. They actually all have to go to trial, and we have to be the guardians to make sure that that happens. More on this in the weeks and months to come, but first, a wonderful interview with Andrea Chalupa from Gaslit Nation next. Our guest for this week is the fantastic Andrea Chalupa. She is the host of a wonderful podcast called Gaslit Nation that I'm sure many of you already listen to. You should be listening to that if you don't already. Andrea, welcome to the show.
Honored to be here. How are you, Tristan?
I'm,
We're going to win. We're going to do great.
No. I mean, when we fight, we win. No, I'm good. How are you?
I just watched a brilliant documentary that everyone can watch for free at saveyourvote.org by the investigative journalist Greg Palast.
Mm-hmm.
It is stunning. It shows the whole neo-Confederacy apparatus that we're up against. Brian Kemp of Georgia, governor of Georgia, who is openly trying to steal the vote for Trump right now as we speak and legalizing this method to do it, as shown in the film Vigilantes, Inc. And I'm just pretty floored by that. And I know we have other things to talk about,
right,
but I encourage you to get him on your show. And I want to ask you, as a former prosecutor who wrote a brilliant book that I love and I refer to, and I wish I had you on speed dial, which I respect boundaries, but I want to just ask you, why do you think the DOJ, the feds, don't do more to step in and stop Brian Kemp from allowing vigilante justice, white militia mobs to basically terrorize Black voters? Why isn't the DOJ Civil Rights Division stepping in more? We had the National Guard going in during the whole civil rights struggle. What are the mechanisms they could use to try to tamp things down a bit?
I mean, I think that the big problem there is that, and I think this is a problem across the board. It isn't just with this particular issue. It is a problem pretty much throughout the whole range of cases that DOJ could be bringing, should be bringing, is that I think they have a brake on them that has been applied, in my view, improperly and inappropriately and really tragically to not look political.
Mm-hmm.
So they want to, they're not going to do anything that could make it look like in their eyes, or in the eyes of some imaginary centrist commentator. That's a lot of the problem here, is I think they're worried about oh, what will the Times editorial page say? And I know that thankfully the Biden and Harris people have been thinking less about that, sort of Gang of 500 kind of garbage. Do we really need to care what David Brooks has to say about anything anymore? No,
and the answer is no.
The answer is absolutely no. And we don't need to care what the editorial board has to say about anything either, because in my view, there's a fundamental bias problem with corporate media and legacy media, where Donald Trump literally saved their business model as of 9 years ago. And if they're deathly afraid that if he fades away or if he's imprisoned, that their business model will collapse out from under them. And I think that is definitely something that could happen. And so in my view, they're in the bag for him. I know I'm taking the long way around to get to your answer.
You're absolutely correct.
DOJ in turn, and I do think that this is not just them. It's a lot of people want to blame Merrick Garland. I do think that there are probably voices of excessive caution in the West Wing around Biden that are saying whoa, we better not do anything that looks like we're being too political, lest these folks say that we're being too political. We don't want to. So they're not going after any of what's going on in Georgia. They're not going after Donald Trump for violating the Logan Act by going and meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu. And the PBS, not me, it's not, I didn't report this. PBS has reported that there was in fact a deal struck between Trump and Netanyahu at that fake summit that they had at Mar-a-Lago back in the summer. And that is why, it helps explain why Netanyahu has made it clear. Very interestingly, and this he had said this was about a week and a half ago, that at that point he was saying, well, we're not going to do any ceasefire talks for the next 45 days. Why 45 days?
Exactly.
What would 45 days take you to? At the moment that he said that, 45 days later was like November 7th. Right? It's like, why that artificial time period? Nobody normally thinks in like 45-day increments necessarily. Like, why 45 days? And it was like, oh, conveniently, it's 45 days. But there's so many of these other things. Why isn't anybody pushing harder on the cases that did get filed? And it's not just DOJ. Why did Alvin Bragg and the Manhattan DA's office not go to the mat to try to actually have the sentencing occur in the campaign cover-up case where Trump got convicted? Now is not going to happen until after the election with the consent of the Manhattan DA's office. So the what you pinpoint here is exactly right, but it's the tip of a much larger iceberg of cowardice.
Absolutely, because we have precedent in American history of the National Guard being sent in during the Civil Rights Movement.
That's correct.
Federal intervention to protect lives. Because what Vigilante Inc., and again, it's free. People can go to saveyourvote.org. I'm not involved in that project. I'm just interviewing Greg Palast on my podcast. And I just watched this film. So I need a pinata right now. Like, I'm full of rage. And you're the first person I'm talking to after finishing this movie. So that's why I'm unloading here. But so we have a whole history of federal intervention to literally save lives. His documentary shows that non-white organizers were so harassed by Brian Kemp's government that one was even driven to die by suicide. And they were threatened with years in prison, federal felonies. There needs to be federal intervention at this point. Like, we need to normalize federal intervention, and we have a long history of precedent that we can point to. Right.
You go all the way back to the 50s. You can go back to Eisenhower was willing to send in guys with guns to make sure that schools got desegregated. It picked up more under Kennedy and Johnson with protecting voting rights. We had to, because otherwise you would still have apartheid in the South.
I think we know your next book, Tristan. Okay.
Well, there's a lot of possibilities there. I'm not even worrying about that until after the election. But yeah, but you're totally right. There is a long, long precedent there, but we've kind of forgotten about it. Like, the thing is that you should be able to then have someone stand up and say that this is a bipartisan issue. This is about protecting the vote, right? This is about making sure that voters feel safe when they go to the polls, that canvassers feel safe when they're going to get people out to vote, and that this is a bipartisan, nationwide, not even bipartisan, it's a nonpartisan issue. Okay. And if it so happens that the offenders are disproportionately Republican, then so be it. And somebody needs to stand up and say that. I feel the same way about the foreign corruption issue that we clearly now have, like, just absolutely metastasizing in this country. We don't even know yet how bad it is, because we've only seen a couple of the data points, right? We know about Trump and the $10 million from Egypt. We know about Trump and all the help he's gotten from Russia. We know about Kushner and the Saudis. We know about Bob Menendez and Egypt. And now we know about Eric Adams and at least Turkey, and according to New York Times reporting, possibly as many as 5 other countries or more that potentially paid him. The indictment is only about Turkey, but we don't know what else they dug into, but maybe decided that it was just a cleaner, easier indictment. A lot of times DOJ or any prosecutor will not go after every crime it could go after just because they want a clean conviction. They want to get it in front of a jury, get the unanimity, get out, get done, without a risk of it becoming like a bigger thing that then results in a hung jury. Or
then
worse,
what happens to all those crimes that go unaddressed?
Oh, in that situation? I mean, I think the thinking is that if you're going to get them on the one, you put them away, that's a good win. And that part I actually don't really disagree with. There's some things that these prosecutors do that I'm sitting there just being like, you're chicken. Mm-hmm. You are a complete coward. You're not doing your job. You're too worried about what other people will think of you. You're too worried about whether you'll get reelected, something else, and you don't have the balls for this job. You don't have the chutzpah for this job.
Exactly.
That's the way I feel about a lot of them. Now, I do feel differently about things like taking extra time before you go out there and make your case public. I think sometimes it's warranted. And I do believe that having a tighter, more focused indictment or complaint, if it's a civil prosecution, is sometimes the right way to go. It just depends on the case. I was going to ask you the question that I think you've already answered, but I'm going to just ask it again because I bet you you're going to come up with something else. I love asking this question of folks who really cover this space like you do. What is something that you've been covering and talking about or have been wanting to talk about more that you don't feel everybody else is talking about enough? You've identified one, but is there another one that you've got that's just like, why am I the only one talking about this issue? What's another one?
Okay, so it is the surreal sensation I have that I suspect I'm living in some AI created simulation.
Yeah.
Because this month I launched a book called In the Shadow of Stalin, The Story of Mr. Jones. It is a graphic novel adaptation of my journalistic thriller that came out a couple years ago. And I know I sound like I'm about to plug a book, but wait until you hear what I'm leading up to and you'll understand why this is very surreal. Mm-hmm. So my journalistic thriller, Mr. Jones, which is on Hulu, Amazon, it is directed by 3-time Academy Award nominee Agnieszka Holland, who was born and raised in Soviet-occupied Poland. Mm-hmm. Her parents were both journalists. Her father's official cause of death was suicide while under police interrogation. Yeah. Making this journalistic thriller with me, like, she had a lot to say with this film. Mm-hmm. And I had a lot to say with it because it was inspired by my grandfather, who was born and raised in Donbass, Ukraine, mm-hmm. which is right now under Russian occupation. Right. My grandfather grew up speaking in Ukrainian, thinking in Ukrainian, and now Donbass is primarily Russian because Stalin came in, mass murdered several millions of Ukrainians, and over time, through a man-made famine, a forced famine called the Holodomor, which is the Ukrainian word of death by hunger. And over time, they repopulated the area with Russians. And then Putin built off that legacy by invading Donbass in spring of 2014, saying we've got to go in and protect the Russian speakers, which was bullshit, as we all know. It's just genocidal Russian imperialism that's been going on for centuries, and Putin's the latest czar to do it. Stalin was a czar. He was the head of the Soviet Empire, and so on. So I made a film about this, showing the story of the Holodomor through this real-life, fearless investigative journalist that really existed. He was from Wales. His name was Gareth Jones. He's played by the brilliant James Norton, a British star that's on the short list to be the next James Bond. He was in Grantchester, Little Women, and it also stars Vanessa Kirby and Peter Sarsgaard. And it shows how Gareth Jones risked his life for the truth. And it shows what classic journalism is in an age of disinformation today, and that there aren't two sides of a story. Like, as my film says, and now the graphic novel In the Shadow of Stalin, there's only one truth. A fact is a fact. There's only one truth. There are not alternative facts, as Kelly Conway called them. And the villain of Mr. Jones was the New York Times bureau chief based in Moscow. His name was Walter Duranty. He won a Pulitzer Prize for publishing Soviet press releases, essentially. Like, he wrote glowingly about the Kremlin. There was a big investigation commissioned by the New York Times by a historian by the name of Mark von Hagen that urged, in re-examining his Pulitzer Prize-winning reporting, urged the Pulitzer Board to rescind the prize, which they've never done before. And the Pulitzer Board refused because they felt like, well, that was just shoddy reporting. They didn't have the same standards we have today, which is nonsense. Like, he was in the pocket of the Kremlin.
Right.
And his contemporaries, the ones that actually practiced journalism, said, we all assumed the Kremlin owned him. They bought him.
Right.
He lived a celebrity lifestyle. He'd have lavish parties. He had a chauffeur, a big apartment in the center of Moscow. He was the social ringmaster of Moscow. He would go to New York City, get feted at the Algonquin Round Table, huge celebrity. And so it's not surprising that he was bought off in that way by the Kremlin. Like, they gave him access journalism, which increased his power. And now fast forward to today with my graphic novel of my film coming out. At the same exact time, the DOJ indictment revealed that there is a Russian disinformation network that was paying off major MAGA influencers for hundreds of thousands of dollars, including one getting $400,000 in a month.
Right.
And these idiots include Benny Johnson, there was Dave Rubin and Tim Pool. And they're claiming, oh, we had no idea. Media is collapsing. Journalism is collapsing.
Right.
If someone puts $400,000 in your pocket, you have an idea. You know where that money is coming from. So, as I always say on Gaslit Nation, if it sounds like a paid Kremlin shill, it's a paid Kremlin shill.
That's right.
And so my question to you, because I've been, as you can imagine, my book coming out at the same time as these big DOJ indictments.
Yeah.
I'm just like, now do Congress, now do Marjorie Taylor Greene, now do Matt Gaetz. So what is the DOJ's thinking where we have this growing Kremlin clown car in Congress that deliberately held up aid to Ukraine for 6 months, which gave Russia the advantage on the battlefield?
It actually gave them signs of life, right? And as soon as we started actually committing aid again, the tide turned. It's a very predictable outcome.
Yeah. Right. So what can the DOJ do? So obviously, these Kremlin influencers, MAGA influencers, Benny Johnson, Tim Pool, they're off the hook, right? I guess the First Amendment, as far as we know, right? They're like, what is your read on, like, what is their fate? Are they forced to give back the money? Can we seize their money for reparations for Ukraine? Because Tim Pool was saying Ukraine is our enemy. He was getting paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to convince his MAGA loyals that Ukraine is our enemy. So can't we seize his money, his bank accounts for Ukraine reparations?
Here's the thing. I don't know what they were able to find or not find. The more troubling question would be if they did not bother to look. You know, if I were involved in prosecuting that case, there's no way that you don't then also go and subpoena the bank accounts of the people who received the money, right? And then you start figuring out, like, maybe we need to go get emails from these people. Maybe we need to go get their text messages, right? You need to be able to understand, did they have knowledge of what it was that they were getting? Well, I'm not going to, like, it is possible, but I don't think super likely that they didn't know. Like, I don't know if I believe that, but like, they definitely needed to go look, and we don't know yet whether or not the authorities bothered to go looking, right? If it could be proven that they knew, or a lot of times the standard, you know, some of these things get into, you've got criminal sanctions, you've got, you know, actually getting indicted, and then there's what's referred to as civil forfeiture. And the standard for that is a little bit lower. It's not the same as, oh, we're going to put you in prison. You know, you can get money seized from you that you received improperly, and that if you knew or should have known that it was coming from an improper source. So why that hasn't happened yet, maybe it's going to. I sure hope they looked to see whether or not these guys had any kind of inkling of what was going on, because I bet you they did, but we don't know. But you have to go look. You have to go look.
If the money came from the Kremlin, can that just be, okay, that automatically,
it would depend on where
seizure?
Exactly it came from, right? We don't, I don't know. Do we know that yet? Because I'm actually unsure
it's buried
of some of the details.
Shell companies. So like the main source was a Canadian shell company, and then there's a company set up in Tennessee, and that's how they
didn't even bother to run it through a bunch of fake small dollar. Right. Like that's what they did with, that's what the Turks did with Eric Adams, allegedly, is that they ran a bunch of money to Adams through fake small dollar donors that then in turn triggered New York City's matching funds to then give him a whole bunch more money for his campaign. But they ran it through a bunch of fake small dollar donors. If you get $300,000 showing up in your bank account from a shell company that you haven't worked with, that I believe would qualify as a new or should have known situation. You at that point are on notice. You need to be going and asking questions about if that money showed up today for me. If I suddenly got $300,000 from a bank account that I didn't know of, from somebody that I wasn't, it wasn't one of my clients or something, I'd be like, what the hell is this?
I would call the police.
I would call the authorities. I'd call my bank.
Someone's trying to get me arrested.
I would call my bank and then potentially the authorities, depending on what my bank did, right? That's what you've got to do. Now, if you suddenly get like a surge in small dollar crowdfunding, then maybe I could see it. But if that didn't happen here, if they just got like Acme Corp based in Vladivostok has suddenly now sent me like $300,000. Actually, it was denominated in whatever trillion number of rubles that is now. And then it's $300,000. It's like, you got to ask some questions. That's the thing. If that's what it was, then I don't know how you don't know.
Exactly right.
I don't know how you don't know at that point. So, by the way, I wanted to throw one other note in there is that yes, the czars, past and present, have long used the I have to protect our fellow ethnic co-speakers of language in this place, and so we're sending troops in. Yeah, that was also a trick that Hitler did.
Yes.
As many of you know. That was his excuse for going into Czechoslovakia, and it was then his excuse for going into Poland. And I'm just going to note this for the record because we've been bringing up a certain institution that has occasionally engaged in some pretty questionable practices over the years and still does today. But the New York Times in 1939, this is a fun fact. Actually, on the day that World War II began with the German invasion of Poland, September 1st, 1939, the New York Times ran a piece basically taking the German government, the Nazi government, Hitler government at face value, and reported on the excursion of Polish troops over the German border, which was the very flimsy and obviously false bullshit reason that the Germans gave for invading Poland. They actually went so far as to take prisoners, I believe, and put them in Polish army uniforms that they had stolen and actually had them come across the border and then with the prisoners killed them.
Right.
To make it look like a Polish invasion that Germany then was countering. And the New York Times swallowed that story and delivered it whole to its readership on September 1st, 1939. So let's just remember about how these things sometimes work, and that you're totally right to point this out. Access journalism and press release journalism has existed for a very, very long time. And it still exists today, and it has a very long, dirty, ugly history, and we need to call it out wherever we see it in the present day, too.
Yes, absolutely. And the New York Times, known as the newspaper of record, when historically it's the newspaper of power.
Right.
So, yeah. And I want to also point out a fun fact that you cannot stay in Russia or you would get arrested. 2 weeks after the Nazis invaded Poland, kicking off World War II, the Nazis invaded the Soviets. The Soviets invaded Poland, and they had a joint Soviet-Nazi military parade.
They did.
And they had this secret pact where Hitler and Stalin agreed to carve up Europe together. You take these countries, I take these countries. And in fact, according to historian Tim Snyder, who was one of the historical advisors on my film, Mr. Jones, and his brilliant book, Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, How Those Two Mass Murderers Influenced Each Other, opens with the story of Gareth Jones, my hero in The Shadow of Stalin, the story of Mr. Jones, and the film. So when they had that pact, Hitler did not start murdering on a mass scale until he joined forces with Stalin.
Right.
Because he felt that protection, that alliance, that he could do whatever he wanted and just go for it.
That's right. No, that precipitated the timing. For anybody who doesn't know the finer points of this, why did they go into? That's exactly right. Why did Hitler go into Poland when he did? It was because that Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. That was the names of the two foreign ministers of the two countries. This secret alliance between the two countries. They actually signed it on, I want to say it was like August 27th. It was something in that range in the last like 2 weeks of August.
That's right.
It was signed and they were already ready to invade Poland. Hitler wanted to get that deal done before he came in because he did not want Russia coming in and saying, hey, you're going into Poland. That's in our sphere of influence historically. We think these countries kind of belong to us, sort of, and in some cases totally. And don't go there because we're going to, we're not going to meet that happily. Once they had that deal struck to carve up Poland and to carve up a lot of the rest of Eastern Europe, that was basically the green light that Hitler was looking for to then really go after a lot more countries. But I think it's good while we're on this topic to talk about some other really eerie parallels here, which is that the West had a chance to save Czechoslovakia. And as many of you know, this was the Munich Agreement. It's one of the most despicable episodes in the history of sort of Western foreign policy, that we sold the Czechs out and let Hitler have them. And then after that had been, that had caused such a public opinion firestorm in these countries when Hitler then proceeded to break his promise, not take the part of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland that he had been saying he was going to take, but then actually went into Prague. Public opinion was so fierce in the UK and the US and to some degree in France that then it caused the Western powers to say, we're going to protect Poland. And that's why they actually said that Poland was the line in the sand. It's because they'd already given up the Czechs. Right. If we give up the Ukrainians today, if we sell them out, it's going to be a green light for Putin to then say, well, what's next on my menu? Where do I want to go next? If he's got troops in Kyiv, where else is he going to go? Poland is a very highly likely destination for him, right? Or the Baltics, right? Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all were part of the Soviet Union, all are now free, and we are sworn to protect them. They're members of NATO. And as is Poland, where is Putin going to go? But if we sell out the Ukrainians, that's going to encourage and embolden Putin the same way that it did with Hitler in the 30s. You give an inch, they're going to take a mile, and then they're going to be like, great, now I'm going to take 5 miles. And if we don't keep the fight up in Ukraine, that fight's going to come further into Europe.
Absolutely. And that is Russia's genocidal history. Just like we have a neo-Confederacy in America represented by Brian Kemp, we're up against legacies of brutality that just reincarnate through new generations. Yep. And so that's why we need to just enforce the laws we already have on the books.
That's true. The laws are on the books. That's exactly right. We need to make sure that if you are tampering with voters' safety and security, if you're engaging in any kind of intimidation and trying to, by color of law, take away people's civil rights, those are both civil and criminal liabilities, right? And we shouldn't be having private citizens like Donald Trump running around engaging in foreign policy. That shouldn't be happening, where it's undercutting the position of the United States government. The position of the Biden administration is to get a ceasefire. And Donald Trump, according to reporting by PBS, undercut that by cutting a deal with Netanyahu. And I can't say that enough, because it is actually one of the fact that this is not a national scandal and something that is on the front page above the fold every frickin' day, Watergate style, is just appalling to me. That this is not that, like, the most of the mainstream media just went, whoop, it just went right over them. And it's against the law too. We have a law in the books called the Logan Act. It's been around since 1799. Because at the beginning of America, there was already a problem with private citizens trying to cut deals with the English or the French, which were the two main powers and at war with each other all the time. And we needed to kind of like try to carve a path between them and not get entangled in their wars. That was the official American foreign policy under Washington and under Adams, was to say, we don't want to get involved in all the endless conflicts between England and France. And they needed to make sure that nobody was going to meddle in that. Hence the Logan Act gets passed. It hasn't been enforced very often in the intervening years, but that doesn't mean it isn't good law. It just means we haven't had enough bad guys willing to go there. Now we do. So yes, we definitely need to be enforcing these laws that are on the books, because if we don't, we're just, again, it's an appeasement issue, right? If you don't actually draw the boundary, whether that's a literal one or a metaphorical one, they're going to keep crossing it, and they're going to go even further. Right? That's how you get these Overton window problems where they're like, oh, well, now I'll do this. Now I'll do this. Now we're going to say, let's go take 10, 20, 30 million Americans, even ones that have legal immigration status, or maybe even ones that are naturalized citizens, and kick them out of the country. It's what I've been referring to as ethnic cleansing by deportation. Well, they want to go further. Right?
They're going to put all of us in camps. It's going to start with the asylum seekers, and it's going to go to the journalists, the professors, everybody.
Legal immigrants, now that's on the table. Project 2025 mentions denaturalization. So even if you become an American citizen, they're going to find a way, and they'll make it look legal to strip away your citizenship status and then say, sorry, you've got to leave. They want to get rid of birthright citizenship. So even if you were born in America, they're going to find a way to say, actually, no, that's not true anymore. If we think you should leave, you should leave.
They're Nazis. Let's just sum it up.
Let's
Nazis.
Let's just sum it up. That's the aspiration, and it's increasingly becoming the reality. And we need to figure out, like, this is it.
Yeah, we're in a war of attrition. We're in the war of attrition against Kremlin-backed neo-Confederacy, Nazism in America. Tristan Snell, come on my podcast, Gaslit Nation.
We'll come
I have
and do
so
this
many
over there
more
too.
questions.
Yeah.
Yes, let's continue this conversation. I want to help you with your next book because I have so many questions. Meaning, I need you to get you to write it. So your next book is going to be how to Trump-proof and Putin-proof our democracy. Show what America could look like if the DOJ, the FBI enforced the laws we already have on our books. What would that look like?
I've already been thinking along those lines. Yeah.
So please get that out there so we could all start manifesting that reality.
I know it's there's a lot that we've got to do there because we need to. I mean, this got into, this was obviously a lot of the Taking Down Trump book, is to talk about what it looks like when you actually have the right leadership and the wrong leadership at the head of a prosecutor's office, and that you have to have that in place before you can even think of going after somebody like a Trump. Right. But yeah, there's a lot more of that, not just about Trump, that needs to happen out there. But this has been fascinating. Thank you so much, Andrea, for coming on the show. Would love to have you back anytime. And yeah, we'll do this over at your place, so to speak, soon. Thank you so much. And hope to have you back.
And we're going to win.
That's it for our show this week. As always, make sure to follow this podcast so that you get all of the episodes automatically downloaded to your devices each week. That includes our special series, Decoding Project 2025, which we are still recording more of those, and there are more of those to come. There's already a lot for you to go listen to, so make sure to check those out. As always, for the latest, make sure to follow me on Twitter and to subscribe to my Substack. That is free. You'll always get the latest and greatest there, and we'll see you next time.